I was 21 years old, standing outside the gates of St. Catherine's Home for Children in Portland, Oregon, with everything I owned packed into 2 duffel bags and a backpack. It was my official aging out day, the moment every kid in the system both dreams of and dreads. I'd been at St. Catherine's since I was 7, after my mother died, and no relatives could be found to take me in. 14 years of shared bedrooms, cafeteria meals, and the constant underlying knowledge that I was temporary, that I didn't quite belong anywhere. The social worker, Mrs. Henderson, had gone through the standard exit procedures with me the day before. She'd given me information about housing assistance, job placement programs, and emergency contacts. She'd also handed me a small envelope containing my birth certificate, social security card, and exactly $847 in savings from various odd jobs I'd done over the years. It wasn't much to start a life with, but it was all I had. I'd already arranged to stay at a youth hostel downtown for a few weeks while I looked for work and tried to figure out my next steps. I had no family, no safety net, and no real plan beyond survival. That's when I noticed him. An older man, probably in his late 60s, standing near the bus stop across the street. He was watching me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He wore work clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, and had the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. When our eyes met, he started walking toward me. My first instinct was to be wary. You don't grow up in the foster system without developing a healthy suspicion of strangers who take too much interest in you. "Excuse me," he called out as he approached. "Are you Marcus Webb?" The fact that he knew my name stopped me cold. I turned to face him fully, my hand instinctively gripping the strap of my duffel bag tighter. "Who's asking?" I replied, keeping my voice neutral but firm. He stopped a respectful distance away, seeming to understand my caution. "My name is Robert Chen. I was a friend of your mother's a long time ago. I've been trying to find you for years, but the system makes it difficult to track down kids in foster care. When I finally located you here, they told me you were aging out today. The mention of my mother caught me off guard. I had so few memories of her, just fragments really. The smell of her perfume, the sound of her laugh, the way she used to sing while cooking dinner. She died when I was so young that sometimes I wondered if I was remembering her, or just remembering the stories other people had told me about her. "What do you want?" I asked, still suspicious but now curious too. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a large manila envelope. "Your mother and I were close friends back in the day. She talked about you constantly, about the future she wanted to give you. Before she died, she made some arrangements. I promised her I'd make sure you knew about them when you turned 18, but it took me longer than expected to find you." He handed me the envelope. I hesitated before taking it, still not entirely sure this wasn't some kind of scam or mistake. Inside were several documents, legal papers that looked official and complicated. "What is this?" I asked, flipping through pages I didn't understand. "That," Robert said with a slight smile, "is the deed to a farm in eastern Oregon, about 200 miles from here. It's been in your name since you were 5 years old. Your mother bought it shortly before she died, using money she'd saved and some help from a few of us who cared about her. She wanted you to have something solid, something that couldn't be taken away." I stared at him, then at the papers, then back at him. This had to be a mistake or a cruel joke. Kids like me didn't inherit property. We inherited nothing but the clothes on our backs and the knowledge that we had to make it on our own. "There's no way," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "There's no way my mother owned a farm. We lived in a tiny apartment. She worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Where would she get money for land?" Robert's expression softened with something like sadness. "Your mother was more resourceful than you knew. She worked hard, saved every penny. And when she got sick, when she knew she was running out of time, she made it her mission to secure your future. A group of us pitched in to help her make the down payment. The property wasn't expensive because it needed a lot of work, but it was paid off completely before she died. She set up a trust that covered the property taxes until you turned 21. As of today, it's yours free and clear." My mind was reeling. A farm. My mother had bought me a farm. I'd been preparing myself for life in a hostel, scraping by on minimum wage jobs, maybe eventually saving enough for a studio apartment somewhere. And all this time, I'd had property with my name on it. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, anger suddenly cutting through the shock. Why did I spend 14 years in the system when I had this? Robert sighed deeply. The trust was set up specifically to transfer to you at 21, not before. Your mother worried that if the authorities knew about it earlier, there might be legal complications or attempts to sell it to pay for your care. She wanted to make sure it stayed yours, untouched, until you were old enough to claim it yourself. I tried to check on you over the years, but the system is protective of kids' information for good reasons. It took me hiring a lawyer to finally track you down here. I looked down at the papers again, trying to process what this meant. According to the deed, the property was 145 acres near a town called Fossil, Oregon. I'd never heard of it. What kind of condition is it in? I asked. I honestly don't know, Robert admitted. I haven't seen it in years. Your mother bought it from an estate sale. It was a working farm at one point, but it had been abandoned for a while even then. It probably needs significant repairs and updates. But the land is good, and the structure was solid last time I saw it. It's something real, Marcus. It's a foundation. A foundation. The word resonated with me. I'd never had a foundation, never had anything permanent or truly mine. There's more, Robert said, pulling out a letter from his own pocket. Your mother wrote this for you. She asked me to give it to you when I found you. I've been carrying it for years. He handed me the sealed envelope, and I could see my name written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow felt I should know. My hands trembled as I took it. Take your time, Robert said gently. Read it when you're ready, but I want you to know that if you decide to go out to the property, I'd be happy to drive you there and help you get settled. Your mother was a good friend to me, and I promised her I'd look after you if I ever got the chance. I stood there on the sidewalk outside St. Catherine's, holding documents that said I owned land and a letter from the mother I barely remembered, and for the first time since I was 7 years old, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd always believed. I didn't open my mother's letter right away. Instead, I accepted Robert's offer to drive me to the farm, partly because I had nowhere else to go, and partly because I needed to see this place with my own eyes before I could believe it was real. We stopped at a diner first, where Robert insisted on buying me lunch while we talked. Over burgers and coffee, he told me stories about my mother that I'd never heard before, how she'd been funny and determined, how she'd worked as a waitress and a house cleaner, how she'd talked endlessly about her dreams for my future. She was sick for almost a year before she died, Robert explained, his coffee cup held between weathered hands. Cancer. She kept working as long as she could because she was trying to save money. When she finally told us how bad it was, a few of us from the church decided to help. We pooled some money together, and she found this property listed cheap because it needed work. She was so excited about it, Marcus. She'd talk about how you'd have space to run around, how you could have animals and grow your own food. She wanted you to have the kind of childhood she couldn't give you in the city. Listening to him, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Grief for the mother I'd lost, anger that she'd died so young, and overwhelming gratitude that she'd thought far enough ahead to try to secure something for me. Why didn't she tell me? I asked. I was 7. I could have understood at least some of it. Robert looked down at his coffee. She tried to, toward the end. But you were so young, and she was so sick. I think she wanted to protect you from the weight of it all. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd make sure you got the property when you were old enough to appreciate it and use it properly. After lunch, we drove east out of Portland, leaving the city behind and heading into increasingly rural territory. The landscape changed gradually from suburbs to farmland to the high desert country of eastern Oregon. It took us nearly 4 hours, and during that time, Robert filled me in on what he knew about the area. Fossil was a tiny town, population less than 500 in Wheeler County. The nearest larger town was over 50 miles away. The economy was based mostly on ranching, farming, and tourism from people visiting the John Day Fossil Beds National Monument. "It's isolated," Robert warned me. "Not everyone is cut out for that kind of life, especially if you're used to the city. There's no fast internet, no shopping centers, no real nightlife. The nearest hospital is 60 miles away. It's the kind of place where people know each other's business and newcomers stand out." I'd grown up in Portland, but I'd never felt connected to city life. At St. Catherine's, we'd been somewhat isolated anyway, living in our own institutional world. The idea of space and quiet actually appealed to me more than the thought of navigating city life alone with less than $1,000 to my name. When we finally turned off the main highway onto a gravel road marked by a faded mailbox with web still barely visible on the side, my heart started pounding. The road was rough, overgrown with weeds on both sides, and clearly hadn't been maintained in years. We drove for almost a mile before the house came into view, and when it did, I felt my stomach drop. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure that had probably been beautiful once, but now looked like it was barely standing. The white paint had peeled away to grey wood in most places. Several windows were broken, covered with boards or plastic. The porch sagged dangerously on one side, and the roof had visible holes in places. Surrounding the house were several outbuildings in similar states of disrepair. A barn with a collapsed section of roof, a chicken coop with no door, and what looked like it might have been a workshop or storage shed that was leaning at a precarious angle. The property was overgrown with tall grass and weeds, and there were signs that animals had been using the buildings for shelter. Robert parked the truck, and we sat there for a moment in silence. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I knew it needed work, but I didn't realize it had deteriorated this much. If you want to leave, I understand. We can talk about other options." But something strange happened as I sat there looking at that broken-down farm. Instead of feeling discouraged, I felt a spark of something I'd rarely experienced before: possibility. This was mine. It was damaged and neglected, but it was mine. No landlord could evict me, no social worker could tell me I had to leave, no system could move me to another placement. For the first time in my life, I had a place that belonged to me. "I want to look inside," I said, opening the truck door. Robert looked surprised but followed me out. We approached the house carefully, testing the porch steps before putting our full weight on them. The front door was locked, but Robert had brought the keys that had been in the trust documents. The lock was rusty and took some effort, but eventually the door swung open with a loud creak. The inside was actually better than I'd expected. The structure seemed sound despite the cosmetic damage. There was electricity, though Robert warned me we'd need to have it inspected before turning it on. The plumbing would need checking too. There was old furniture covered in dust and animal droppings, but the floors were solid hardwood under the debris. The kitchen had ancient appliances and cabinets that had seen better days, but the layout was functional. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. One of the bedroom windows was broken, letting in weather and animals, but the other rooms were relatively intact. We spent over an hour exploring the property. The barn was the biggest concern. Part of the roof had collapsed, but the foundation and main structure could potentially be salvaged with serious work. The land itself rolled gently across hills covered in wild grass and sagebrush, with a creek running through the eastern section. According to the property survey in my documents, there were 145 acres total, including some wooded areas at the back of the property. Robert pointed out where fence lines had been, though most of the fencing was now gone or broken down. This would have been a cattle operation originally, he explained. Small scale, probably 20 to 30 head at most. The land could support that if the fences were rebuilt and the water sources maintained properly. As the sun started setting, painting the hills in shades of orange and gold, I sat down on a relatively stable section of the porch and finally opened my mother's letter. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, and I had to blink away tears to read her handwriting. "My dearest Marcus," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've grown into the young man I always knew you'd become. I'm so sorry I won't be there to see it. I'm sorry for so many things, but most of all, I'm sorry that I'm leaving you alone. I want you to know that this farm represents every hope I had for your future. It's not much right now, just land and an old house, but it's yours. No one can take it from you. I bought it because I wanted you to have roots, to have a place in this world that belonged to you completely. I wanted you to have the freedom to build whatever life you choose, with space to grow and room to breathe. The letter went on for 2 pages, talking about her love for me, her regrets about getting sick, and her hopes that I'd find happiness and purpose. She'd written specific instructions too, practical things about the property and suggestions for what I might do with it. At the end, she wrote something that hit me like a punch to the chest. You come from strength, Marcus. You come from people who survived hard things and kept going. This land is my gift to you, but your real inheritance is that strength. Whatever you decide to do with this place, whether you keep it or sell it or turn it into something completely new, know that I believe in you. You're not alone, even when it feels like you are. You carry me with you, and you carry the love of everyone who helped make this possible. Build something beautiful, baby. Build a life that makes you happy. And I sat there on that broken porch, crying for the first time in years, mourning the mother I'd lost, and grateful for the gift she'd somehow managed to give me from beyond the grave. If you've made it this far in the story, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe in second chances and new beginnings. Drop a comment below telling me, if you suddenly inherited property in a remote location, would you take the chance and move there, or would you sell it and stay where you are? Your answers always inspire me and help me understand what stories resonate with you. Now let's continue with Marcus's journey. Robert offered to let me stay at his place back in Portland while I figured things out, but I declined. Something about the farm had captured me, and I wanted to stay, at least for a few days, to really understand what I'd inherited. We drove into Fossil to buy supplies, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, some basic food, cleaning supplies, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The general store was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, with creaky wooden floors and shelves stocked with everything from groceries to hardware to clothing. The woman behind the counter, probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looked us over with frank curiosity. "You folks just passing through?" she asked as she rang up our purchases. "Actually," Robert said, nodding toward me, "Marcus here just inherited the old Webb property outside of town. He's planning to stay for a bit and assess the situation." The woman's eyebrows rose with interest, and I could practically see her recalibrating her assessment of me. "The Webb place? That property's been sitting empty for almost 16 years. You're Sandra Webb's boy." The mention of my mother's name in this stranger's mouth startled me. "You knew her?" I asked. "Met her once, briefly, when she came out here to look at the property before buying it. Sweet woman, very determined. She talked about fixing up the place for her son." The woman extended her hand across the counter. "I'm Dorothy Miller. My husband and I run this store and the gas station next door. If you need anything while you're here, you just ask. This is a small town, and we look after each other." After leaving the store, Robert helped me get set up in the least damaged bedroom of the farmhouse. We cleaned out the debris, covered the broken window with plastic sheeting and boards, and set up my sleeping bag on an old bed frame after checking that it was structurally sound. He also showed me where the well was and how to check if the water was still good. The pump was old but functional, and after running it for several minutes to clear the pipes, the water came through clear and cold. "That's a good sign," Robert said. "Wells are expensive to repair or replace. If this one is solid, that's one major system you won't have to worry about immediately." Before he left to drive back to Portland, Robert pressed $500 in cash into my hand, despite my protests. "Your mother would want you to have a cushion," he insisted. "This isn't charity. It's paying forward what she did for others when she was alive. Take it, get your feet under you, and if you decide to make a go of this place, call me. I know some people who might be willing to help with repairs." That first night alone in the farmhouse was both terrifying and exhilarating. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind rattling the loose boards, animals moving in the walls, the settling of old wood. But lying there in my sleeping bag, I felt something I'd never quite experienced before, a sense of belonging. This place, broken as it was mine. I could make decisions about it without asking permission. I could stay or go based purely on what I wanted, not what some system required of me. That freedom was intoxicating and overwhelming in equal measure. The next morning I woke with the sunrise and started a more thorough exploration of the property. In the daylight, I could see details I'd missed the evening before. Behind the barn, there were the remains of what had been a vegetable garden, now completely overgrown, but with some perennial herbs still struggling to survive among the weeds. The creek, I'd noticed, ran year-round, according to the property documents, fed by springs in the hills. There were several groves of trees, mostly juniper and some ponderosa pine, that could potentially be harvested for firewood or lumber. The more I walked the land, the more I began to see not what it was, but what it could become. Over the next few days, I fell into a routine. I'd wake up early, eat a simple breakfast, then spend the day working on the most urgent repairs. I started with clearing debris, pulling weeds, and boarding up the remaining broken windows properly. I found tools in the partially collapsed workshop, rusty but still functional saws, hammers, wrenches, and other equipment left behind by whatever family had owned the farm before my mother bought it. Each evening, I'd drive into town to use the library's internet and phone to research things I needed to know. Basic home repair, water systems, what crops grew well in this climate, what it took to raise livestock. Dorothy at the general store had been right about the community looking after each other. Word had spread quickly that Sandra Webb's son had come to claim the property, and people started showing up. A rancher named Tom Patterson, who owned the adjacent property, stopped by with a box of vegetables from his garden and offered advice about the well and septic system. A retired contractor named Bill Morrison drove out to look at the barn and gave me a realistic assessment of what could be saved and what needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Even the local pastor, Father McGinnis from the tiny Catholic church in town, stopped by to introduce himself and offer assistance if I needed it. "Your mother was a woman of faith," he told me, as we sat on the porch drinking water from the well. "She came to me when she was sick, asking me to pray for you. She wanted to make sure you'd grow up safe and with opportunities. Looks like she found a way to give you both." The kindness of these strangers, their willingness to help someone they didn't know simply because of a connection to my mother, was almost overwhelming. I'd grown up in a system where everyone was overworked and overwhelmed, where kindness was rationed because there was never enough to go around. This was different. These people helped because that's what their community did. After a week on the property, I had to make a real decision. I'd used up most of my meager savings on supplies, and I'd need income soon if I was going to stay. The sensible thing would be to go back to Portland, find a job, and figure out what to do with the farm from a distance. Maybe rent it out, maybe eventually sell it. But every time I thought about leaving, something in me resisted. I'd spent my entire childhood being moved around, never quite settling anywhere. The thought of walking away from the one place that was truly mine felt like giving up on something important, even if I couldn't quite articulate what that something was. I called Robert to talk through my options. He listened patiently as I explained my thoughts, the pull I felt towards staying versus the practical concerns about money and survival. "What does your gut tell you?" he finally asked. "My gut tells me I should stay and try to make this work," I admitted. "But my head tells me I'm being stupid and idealistic." Robert laughed softly. "Your mother struggled with that same conflict her whole life. Her heart always wanted to reach for more, but practical concerns kept pulling her back. In the end, she chose to reach. That's why you have this farm. If you want to stay and try to build something here, I'll support you however I can. But you need to be realistic about what you're taking on. That property needs tens of thousands of dollars in repairs to be truly livable and functional. You'll need income, and job opportunities in a town that small are limited. You'll be isolated, especially in winter. It's going to be hard, Marcus. Everything's been hard, I responded. At least this kind of hard is for something that's mine. That conversation crystallized my decision. I was going to stay and try to make the farm work. I had no clear plan and very little money, but I had land, some basic tools, and a growing network of people willing to offer advice and occasional help. It wasn't much, but I'd started with less before. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped at the small office that served as the local employment center and community bulletin board. There were a handful of job postings: ranch hand positions, part-time work at the gas station, seasonal work with the Forest Service. I took down information for several options, knowing I'd need to piece together income from multiple sources. Dorothy at the general store had mentioned they occasionally needed help with deliveries and stocking. Tom Patterson had hinted that he could use an extra hand during calving season. It wouldn't be glamorous or high-paying work, but it would be enough to survive while I worked on the property. I also stopped by the county extension office to introduce myself and ask about resources for new farmers. The agent there, a woman named Linda Hartley, who seemed genuinely excited to meet someone young interested in agriculture, loaded me up with pamphlets and information about everything from soil testing to grant programs for agricultural development. There are programs specifically designed to help young and beginning farmers, she explained, spreading brochures across her desk. Low-interest loans for equipment and infrastructure, cost-sharing programs for conservation practices, even some grants for diversified operations. You won't get rich, but if you're smart and willing to work hard, you can build a sustainable operation. She also warned me about the challenges, the isolation, the financial instability of farming, the physical toll of the work, and the learning curve for someone without experience. But, she added with a smile, you've got good land and water rights, which is more than half the battle in this part of the state. If you're serious about this, you've got a real shot. As I drove back to the farm that evening with a truck bed full of information, job applications, and a renewed sense of purpose, I passed a weathered sign at the edge of the property that I'd barely noticed before. It was falling down, half hidden by brush, but I could just make out the faded words, Webb Family Farm. My mother had put up that sign. She'd stood on this land, looked at this same view, and imagined a future for me here. I pulled over, got out of the truck, and spent 20 minutes clearing away the brush and reinforcing the signpost so it stood straight again. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, like I was honoring her vision and claiming my place here. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, more stars than I'd ever seen in the city, and felt something I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. I felt like I was home. My first winter on the farm tested every ounce of determination I had. I'd managed to piece together enough work to survive. 3 days a week, helping Tom Patterson with his cattle operation, weekend shifts at Dorothy's general store, and occasional jobs helping neighbors with repairs or projects. The money was tight, but it covered basic expenses and allowed me to slowly accumulate materials for fixing up the farmhouse. I'd managed to get the electricity inspected and turned on, which was a huge improvement, though I kept usage minimal to save money. The propane heating system needed significant repairs, so I relied heavily on the old wood stove in the living room, spending my evenings cutting and splitting firewood from dead trees on the property. The house was still rough, but I'd made it weatherproof and reasonably comfortable. I'd repaired the roof over the main living areas, replaced the broken windows, and patched the worst of the holes in the walls. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional and warm enough to survive the harsh eastern Oregon winter. What I hadn't anticipated was the profound loneliness. I'd grown up surrounded by people in the foster system, never really alone, even when I felt isolated. Here, I could go days without seeing another person if I wasn't working. The silence was sometimes peaceful and sometimes suffocating. There were nights when I questioned whether I'd made a terrible mistake, whether I should just sell the place and move back to Portland where at least I'd be around people my age. But then spring came, and with it, a shift in perspective. The land transformed almost overnight from brown and dormant to explosively green. Wildflowers covered the hills in waves of color, lupine, Indian paintbrush, and varieties I couldn't name. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and birds I'd never noticed in winter suddenly filled the air with songs. I'd survived my first winter, and the achievement of that felt significant. Linda from the extension office had been checking in on me periodically, and in early April, she stopped by with news about a grant program. It's specifically for young farmers trying to establish sustainable operations, she explained, spreading paperwork across my kitchen table. It's competitive, but I think you've got a good story and a solid piece of land. The grant could give you up to $15,000 for infrastructure improvements, equipment, or livestock purchases. $15,000 seemed like an impossible amount of money to me. With that, I could properly repair the barn, install better fencing, maybe even buy a few head of cattle to start building a herd. Linda helped me fill out the application, which required detailed plans for how I'd use the funds and what my long-term vision for the farm was. Writing it all out forced me to think seriously about what I wanted to build here. I proposed a small-scale, diversified operation, a modest cattle herd for beef production, chickens for eggs and meat, and a large vegetable garden to sell produce at the farmers' market that ran in the nearest larger town during summer months. It was ambitious for someone with my limited experience, but Linda encouraged me to think big. While waiting to hear back about the grant, I started working on projects I could tackle with limited resources. I spent weeks clearing and preparing a large area behind the house for the garden, using Tom Patterson's tractor to break up the hard-packed soil. Tom had become something of a mentor, teaching me about cattle management, land stewardship, and the practical realities of making a living from agriculture in this part of the state. "You'll never get rich doing this," he told me one day as we worked on repairing a section of his fence. "But if you keep your overhead low and diversify your income streams, you can make a decent living and have a quality of life that's hard to match. Nobody's telling you when to wake up or how to spend your day. You succeed or fail based on your own decisions and efforts." In May, I got word that I'd been awarded the full $15,000 grant. I literally sat down on the floor when I read the letter, overwhelmed by the opportunity it represented. Linda came out to help me develop a spending plan that would maximize the impact of the funds. We prioritized structural repairs to the barn, new fencing for pastures, a chicken coop that could house 50 birds, and the purchase of 3 bred heifers that would give me the foundation of a cattle herd. With her guidance and Tom's practical advice, I spent the summer transforming the property. The barn renovation was the biggest project. Bill Morrison, the retired contractor who'd assessed it initially, agreed to supervise the work in exchange for a modest fee and the satisfaction of seeing the old structure restored. He brought in a couple of his former crew members who were semi-retired and looking for light work, and together we spent 6 weeks rebuilding the collapsed section, reinforcing the structure, and making it functional again. Watching that barn come back to life felt like watching the whole farm's potential unfold. With a proper barn, I could store hay, shelter animals during harsh weather, and have workshop space for equipment maintenance and repairs. The neighbors started taking me more seriously too. I was no longer just the city kid who'd inherited a farm he didn't know what to do with. I was becoming a working farmer, someone who was invested in the community and the land. By late summer, I had the 3 pregnant heifers in one pasture, 50 chickens in their new coop, producing more eggs than I could eat, and a garden that was yielding an abundance of vegetables. I started selling eggs and produce at the farmers' market 2 Saturdays a month, which brought in modest income, but more importantly, connected me with customers who appreciated locally grown food. One of those customers was a woman named Rachel Bennett, who was probably 23 or 24 and worked as a teacher in the larger town where the market was held. She'd stop by my booth regularly, always friendly and interested in the farm's progress. "I grew up on a ranch," she told me one Saturday as I bagged up vegetables for her. "I miss it sometimes, the connection to the land and the seasons. What you're building out there sounds wonderful." We started talking more, and eventually she asked if she could visit the farm sometime. Her interest felt different from the neighborly curiosity of the older folks who'd been helping me. It was personal and maybe a little romantic, though I was so inexperienced with relationships that I couldn't be entirely sure. Rachel did visit on a Sunday afternoon in September, and I gave her the full tour of the property. I showed her the restored barn, the thriving garden, the chickens, and the cattle. We walked along the creek and up into the hills where you could see for miles across the high desert landscape. "This is incredible," she said, genuinely impressed. "You've done so much in just over a year. Your mother would be so proud." The mention of my mother still hit me emotionally, even after all this time. "I think about her every day," I admitted, wondering what she'd think, whether I'm doing this right, whether this is what she imagined when she bought the place. Rachel sat down on a rock outcropping overlooking the property. "I think she imagined you having a home and a purpose. Looks like you've found both." We talked for hours that afternoon, about her childhood on her family's ranch, about my years in foster care, about dreams and fears, and what it meant to build a life from scratch. When she left that evening, she hugged me goodbye and said she'd like to come back again soon. Over the following months, she became a regular presence at the farm, visiting most weekends and helping with various projects. She was good with animals, knowledgeable about farming, and brought an energy and optimism that balanced out my sometimes overly serious approach to everything. By my second winter on the farm, life looked dramatically different than it had a year earlier. I had a modest but growing operation, enough income to live reasonably comfortably, and for the first time since leaving St. Catherine's, I had people in my life who felt like family. Tom and his wife had me over for dinner regularly. Dorothy kept me updated on town news and would save damaged goods from the store for me at discount prices. Linda checked in monthly to see how things were going and offer advice on next steps for the operation. And Rachel had become someone I couldn't imagine my life without, someone who understood both the challenges and the rewards of this lifestyle. The 3 heifers had all calved successfully, giving me 6 cattle total and the foundation of a breeding program. The chickens were productive and largely self-sufficient. The garden had produced enough vegetables that I'd been able to preserve food for winter and still have plenty to sell. I'd even started making plans for the next phase, expanding the cattle herd to 15 head, adding beehives for honey production, and potentially offering farm tours and educational workshops for urban families interested in agriculture. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I was standing outside St. Catherine's with everything I owned in 2 duffel bags, but it was better. It was real and challenging and meaningful in ways I'd never experienced before. The farm wasn't just supporting me financially, it was giving me purpose, community, and a sense of belonging I'd searched for my entire life. Some nights, sitting on the porch that I'd repaired and reinforced, watching the sun set over land that was mine, I'd think about parallel universes and alternate paths. What if Robert hadn't found me that day? What if I'd been too scared or too practical to take the risk of staying? What if I'd sold the farm and used the money to set up a conventional life in the city? I'd probably be fine, working some job, paying rent, getting by. But I wouldn't have this, the satisfaction of building something with my own hands, the connection to land and seasons and living things, the community of people who'd welcomed me and taught me and supported my unlikely journey from foster kid to farmer. 3 years after inheriting the farm, I stood in the same spot where I'd first seen the property with Robert, but everything had changed. The farmhouse had been completely renovated, painted a clean white with dark green trim. The porch was solid and welcoming, with chairs where Rachel and I would sit in the evenings. The barn stood proud and functional, housing not just cattle and equipment, but also serving as a venue for the farm workshops I'd started offering. The pastures were neatly fenced, rotating between grazing and rest to maintain the land's health. What had been an abandoned, dying property was now a thriving small farm operation that supported me, employed 2 part-time workers during peak seasons, and contributed to the local agricultural economy. The success hadn't come easily or without setbacks. I'd lost chickens to predators before I learned proper coop security. I'd made costly mistakes with equipment purchases, buying cheap tools that broke instead of investing in quality. I'd struggled through a drought year when the creek ran low and I had to haul water for the cattle, but each challenge had taught me something, and the community had been there to help me learn from mistakes rather than be destroyed by them. Tom Patterson had become like the grandfather I'd never had, teaching me not just about cattle, but about resilience and long-term thinking. Dorothy had extended me credit during tough months, trusting that I'd pay her back when things improved. Linda had continued to connect me with resources and programs that helped small farmers succeed. Rachel and I had gotten engaged the previous spring. She'd moved to the farm 6 months ago, and her presence had transformed not just my personal life, but the operation itself. She had ideas about agritourism and education that I'd never have thought of alone. Together, we'd started hosting school groups for farm tours, teaching kids about where food comes from and the work involved in agriculture. We'd also begun offering weekend workshops for urban families interested in homesteading skills, gardening, chicken keeping, food preservation. These programs brought in additional income while also building connections between rural and urban communities. The herd had grown to 18 head of cattle, a manageable size for our property that allowed us to sell several calves each year while building the breeding stock. We'd added the beehives I'd planned, and Rachel had taken charge of that operation, producing honey that sold quickly at the farmer's market. The vegetable garden had expanded to nearly an acre, and we'd invested in a small greenhouse that extended our growing season. We weren't getting rich, but we were making a comfortable living doing work that felt meaningful. More importantly, we were building something lasting, something that could potentially support a family if we decided to have children someday. Robert had visited several times over the years, always pleased to see the progress, but never taking credit for the role he'd played in making it possible. "Your mother planted the seed," he'd say. "You're the one who made it grow." During his most recent visit, I'd shown him my mother's letter, which I kept framed on the wall of my office in the farmhouse. "She'd be so proud of you," he said, his eyes misty. "She'd love seeing what you've built here, but more than that, she'd love seeing who you've become." That observation stuck with me because it was true. The farm had changed me fundamentally. I'd arrived as a scared 21-year-old with no real skills, no family, and no clear sense of who I was or what I was capable of. The work of restoring the property and building a viable operation had required me to develop confidence, problem-solving abilities, and a willingness to ask for help when I needed it. I'd also learned about community in ways I never had before. In the foster system, community was something provided by institutions, structured and somewhat artificial. Here, community was organic and reciprocal. When my truck broke down during hay season, 3 neighbors showed up with their trucks to help me haul bales. When Tom Patterson had a health scare, Rachel and I helped his wife with their cattle operation until he recovered. When the elementary school needed funding for a new playground, the whole community came together to make it happen, including a fundraiser dinner at our barn. This was what it meant to belong somewhere, to be woven into the fabric of a place and its people. The extended family situation had eventually resolved itself, though not without some difficult conversations. In the first year, a few relatives had reached out, curious about the property now that they'd heard I was successfully farming it. A cousin I barely knew had even suggested I might want to sell and split the proceeds with the family, since that's what your mother would have wanted. But I'd learned to set boundaries and stand firm in my decisions. My mother left this to me specifically because she wanted it preserved as a farm, I'd responded. If she'd wanted it sold and divided, she would have structured things differently. Most family members eventually accepted my choice, and a few, had even become genuinely supportive, visiting the farm and expressing admiration for what I'd built. One unexpected development had been connecting with other young farmers in similar situations. Through the grant program and agricultural organizations, I'd met several people in their 20s and 30s who were also trying to build farming operations from scratch, often against significant odds. We'd formed an informal support network, sharing advice, resources and encouragement. Some were more successful than others, but we all shared the same fundamental commitment to agriculture and land stewardship. These friendships reminded me that while my specific story was unique, the broader challenge of young people trying to access and succeed in agriculture was common and important. Looking back on the journey from that day outside St. Catherine's to where I stood now, I was struck by how much had hinged on a single decision, the choice to take a risk on something uncertain rather than playing it safe. If I'd gone back to Portland, found a conventional job and sold the farm, I'd probably be fine. I might even be making more money, but I wouldn't have this richness of experience, this deep connection to place and purpose, this sense of having built something real with my own hands and heart. The farm had given me exactly what my mother had hoped it would: roots, security, and the freedom to create a life on my own terms. Rachel and I had been talking about our own future and the possibility of children. The idea both excited and terrified me. I'd grown up without parents, moving through a system that couldn't provide the stability and love that children need. Could I be a good father? Could I create the kind of family I'd never had myself? Rachel had confidence that I could. "You've already proven you can build something from nothing," she'd tell me. "You know what it's like to feel unwanted and alone. You'll make sure any child of ours never feels that way." She was right, in a sense. My childhood, painful as it had been, had taught me what children need and what happens when they don't get it. I could give a child what I'd never had: a stable home, consistent love, and the knowledge that they belonged somewhere absolutely and unconditionally. As I stood there thinking about the future, I noticed something I'd planted the previous fall starting to emerge from the soil. Apple trees, 6 of them positioned around the property where they'd eventually provide shade and fruit. They were still just saplings, barely knee-high, but in 5 or 10 years they'd be producing. In 20 years, they'd be mature trees, providing for whoever was living and working on this land. Maybe that would be my children. Maybe they'd grow up climbing those trees, eating apples fresh from the branch, learning to work the land the way I'd learned. The thought filled me with hope and purpose. That evening, Rachel and I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and pink. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. The chickens had settled into their coop for the night, and the farm was quiet, except for the sound of the creek and the evening breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Rachel asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Choosing this life instead of something easier?" I thought about the question seriously before answering. "No," I finally said. "This isn't easier, but it's better. Every hard thing I've dealt with here has been for something that matters, something I'm building for the future. That makes all the difference." She leaned against my shoulder, and we sat there together as the stars started appearing in the darkening sky. In that moment, I felt completely at peace, completely at home. The scared 21-year-old who'd stood outside the orphanage with everything he owned in 2 duffel bags felt like a different person, someone from a past life. That person had been lost, searching for something he couldn't name. This person, the one I'd become through 3 years of hard work, community support, and connection to the land, was found. I'd discovered that home isn't just a place. It's the intersection of purpose, belonging, and the freedom to build a life that reflects your values. My mother had given me the land, but I'd given myself the life, and that made all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that sometimes the most uncertain paths lead to the most meaningful destinations, and that what seems like an ending can actually be a beginning. The gifts we receive from those who love us aren't always obvious or immediate, but they can change everything if we're brave enough to accept them. Before you go, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel and become part of our community. We share stories about unexpected inheritances, second chances, and the courage it takes to build something from nothing. In the comments below, tell me, what's the most valuable thing someone has given you that wasn't money? And what's one lesson Marcus's journey taught you about taking risks or building a life on your own terms? Your stories and reflections always inspire me and remind me why sharing these experiences matters. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.